My name is Paul McFadden. Welcome to On the Line Perspectives on Partition, a series of conversations organised by the Bloody Sunday Trust. The Government of Ireland Act of 1920 provided for two new parliaments on the island of Ireland, only one of which, the one of Stormont, ever actually came into being. The December 20 Act effectively divided the island into two distinct jurisdictions, and partition was cemented 6 months later when the new Parliament of Northern Ireland was opened by King George V in June 1921. Now, whether that occasion was a cause for celebration or regret is, in effect, what this series of conversations aims to explore. Over the next few weeks and months, I'll be asking a range of people from different parts of our community to share their views on the line, on the border, on partition, and all that entailed and all that ensued, really. They'll each share with us an opening statement, which will serve as a prelude to our conversation. And our guest today is Terry Wright, a former vice chairman of the Ulster Unionist Party, who is a regular contributor to the Eamon Malley blog, for those who are familiar with these things, and whose contributions to the political debate here are always candid, first of all, and always thought-provoking. Terry, first of all, you're very welcome to On the Line. It's a pity we're kind of having to meet like this, because ideally we'll meet over a cup of coffee and we'll be talking about probably precisely the kind of things we'll be talking about now, but it has to be done like this for obvious reasons. And before I get you to do kind of your opening statement, how would you describe your politics now? If I could just get that out of the road, first of all, because as I say, you were a prominent Ulster Unionist back in the day. How would you say, or how would you describe yourself now?
Well, first of all, Paul, thank you for your welcome, and hope in this terrible situation that we find ourselves in terms of health that you're keeping well and will continue to do so.
I am, and likewise with yourself, Terry. You're looking well.
With regards to politics, I wouldn't overplay what my role was in the Unionist Party. I was chairman locally of the local association, and then I was a party officer, and then I became deputy chairman of the party. But I'd say I wouldn't overstate what that role was. I didn't have a major input into policy. It was largely organisational, and like most political parties, there's a certain group that's close to the leadership, and they tend to influence things. And anyway, I was in the Unionist Party, and then you may or you may not recall that I had a major disagreement with the party leadership over the radiotherapy issue, which affected the city here, and I think affected the whole of the community. And I resigned as deputy chairman, although I stayed in the party. But I left the party in 2013, and for a number of reasons, which, I mean, this isn't really the purpose of our conversation today, so I'll not go into them all. But these days, I mean, I'm pro-union. I would still support the link with the United Kingdom for a number of reasons, but I'm not involved in party politics in any sense at all. And what it does is to give me the freedom to go where I want, meet who I want, and say what I want. And you're not at risk of going against party policy or upsetting anybody in a political party. But I am pro-union, but I don't describe myself as a Protestant unionist. You know, I do have a Christian faith that I don't shove down anybody's throat, and obviously I'm from a Protestant background, but I'm not a Protestant unionist. These days there's so many terms: civic unionist, pro-union. So I'm just pro-union. I want to see Northern Ireland work. I want to see this city in which we live prosper. I want to see us at peace. And I want to see young people having the opportunities for employment, for advancement, for a good quality of life that many people were denied for a whole number of reasons. So that's where I sit today.
So the line that gives us name to the title of this series of talks, that's the border, obviously I'm talking about, and this series is exploring the whole question of partition. Is it a cause for celebration or regret / commiseration, in your opinion, Terry?
Well, obviously it depends on your perspective. I mean, my view of partition has always been an historical one. It didn't impact on me as such in terms of my political outlook or lifestyle. So I was a history teacher for 36 years, and was studying history as an undergrad, and then doing postgrad, I always looked at history. And when you're looking at history, you're looking at it through a certain prism, and you're looking at cause and consequence. You're looking at what was the motivation of people at the time. You're looking at how things were handled. Could they have been handled differently? And then you're looking at what developed and what flows from that. So that is what my perspective on partition has always been. Is it a cause for celebration? Well, as you well know, Paul, I'm not someone who's known for my smiles. So
we've got one out of you now, though.
yeah, yeah. It's just as well this has been recorded. So I'm not someone that jumps up and down in celebration, but I can understand how the different perspectives there are on this, that people do feel it's a cause for celebration. As I understand, I think the Orange Order are planning to have a parade. That's not something I would be looking to take part in, but if that's what they feel they want to do. But and looking at the centenary and looking at partition, I think there are certain things to celebrate. And I noticed that you have, and I don't want to sound patronizing this, but I noticed that you have hanging behind you on the wall someone like Seamus Heaney. And I think the poetry of Seamus Heaney, he came from this part of the world. He had his views in terms of his politics, but it didn't get in the way of his humanity and of his poetry. And I think that is something to celebrate. And we have a whole lot of other writers and musicians and sports people. And before we started broadcast or recording here, we were chatting about football. And I remember going to support Northern Ireland, and you had people like Gary Fleming and John O'Neill, who I think was a very, very underrated footballer, who played for Leicester City, and Paul Ramsey and Liam O'Kane and Felix Heaney, and all those guys all playing for Northern Ireland. And I don't go to watch Northern Ireland much now, but it's a cause of regret to me that people like that and Johnny Cross and so on that played for Northern Ireland, and we all supported them, and it didn't matter what religion, etc., etc. And it's a matter of regret to me that that doesn't happen today. So I think there are things to celebrate. Our education system, the health system, although it's not perfect and far from it at the moment. If you look at the schools that we have in the city here, how could that not be a cause for celebration for the achievement of what people have done? But I can understand it politically, how people feel it's not a cause for celebration. But I think there's opportunities here for reflection and reconciliation through the centenary. And that's something that I would be encouraging. So to celebrate what people have achieved, but let's sit down and reflect and look and see if we can reconcile some of our misunderstandings, some of our misconceptions through that reflection. And I was very encouraged by what President Higgins was writing, or he was reported rather in the Irish Times, and Simon Coveney was saying much the same thing. You know, there's lots of different narratives, and we need to respect those different narratives and try and understand why people feel the way they do, and maybe agree to disagree. And as you've suggested, Paul, go and have that cup of coffee.
Yeah. Terry, you mentioned you're a history teacher. I'm going to give you a quotation from King George V that day in June 1921 when I
wasn't there. I only looked at
two smiles too.
Yeah,
this is what the king said. I speak from a full heart. Sorry, I speak from a full heart when I pray that my coming to Ireland today may prove to be the first step towards an end of strife among our people, whatever their race or creed. In that hope, I appeal to all Irishmen to pause, to stretch out the hand of forbearance and conciliation, to forgive and forget, and to join in making for the land which they love a new era of peace, contentment, and goodwill. Was the king being naive in saying something like that? When you look at the 100 years of history that have passed since?
I don't think so. I think he must have been genuine in his sentiments, presumably, and it was something that he wished for the people. I suppose as a king, he maybe looked on people as subjects, and as people would know, I'm not the greatest monarchist in the world, but he was presumably looking on people who were subjects, and some of them are no longer going to be subjects, depending on what happened. Although under the treaty, obviously they still recognised the king, and I suppose he wished for peace for the people. So I don't think it was naive. It was an encouragement. It was trying to say, look, this is what you're capable of doing, and it hasn't been 100 years of strife and conflict. Yes, there's been tremendous problems, particularly over the last 40 years, and we paid a heavy toll for it in a number of ways. But I think it was something that people were being encouraged to aspire to. And I think it's a matter of regret that we didn't achieve it for a number of reasons.
That first Northern Ireland Parliament, of the 52 seats, 40 of them were won by the Unionist Party, the then Unionist Party. In the last Assembly election here, so the most recent equivalent kind of election, for the first time in our recent modern history, Unionism lost its majority in the local parliament. Where do you think things began to go wrong for Unionism, or why did they begin to go wrong for Unionism? I know that's a big question, but why?
Well, if you look at the figures for some of those recent elections, Paul, I think I'm not a sexologist by any means, looking at polls and so on, but if you look at the analysis of some of those figures, there's a large number of people who don't vote. There's quite a number of people on the pro-union side who don't vote. Some of them have switched their allegiances in terms of who they vote for because of their attitude to particular issues, which they don't feel are represented within the Unionist Party movement, within political unionism rather. And so, for example, some of them are voting for the Greens, some of them have voted for the Alliance Party. I know some people who voted for the SDLP for a number of reasons. And
for strategic political reasons, kind of.
Political reasons, yeah. But what the figures also seem to show, that if it came to a border poll, those people who are pro-union would still vote to remain in the union, but they're expressing their political wishes in different ways. So recent election results, I think, are interesting, and there's a number of factors that have influenced that. But where did unionism begin to go wrong? I suppose it can sound a bit trite, but almost from day one, Paul. I mean, Carson said himself that, you have to look after your majority. I can't quote you his speech word for word.
Terry, I can quote this. I mean, this is what he told the Unionist Council. He said, and that was February 21. He said, "So I say from the start, be tolerant to all religions, and while maintaining to the last your own traditions and your own citizenship, take care that similar rights are preserved for those who differ from us." Which was a very visionary kind of statement, I think, when you look at it now,
Yeah, I think I would identify myself with. I remember having this conversation with John McAllister, who you would know, and John and I would both have described ourselves as kind of as Carson Unionists in a sense, and that's what we believed as Unionists you should be aspiring to. And I think it's understandable what Unionists did in the early 1920s, and that they felt so insecure. The state was threatened, as it were, externally, and they set up security apparatus, which outlasted longer than it was necessary. You mentioned that sometimes my blogs appear in Eamon Malley. Some of them have been on Slug Row Tool recently, and I've written one at the present time saying that Unionists developed this very enclosed thinking and orthodoxy. This notion of united we stand, divided we fall, and people were expected to comply with it. Institutions like the churches complied with it, and I think it lacked the quality assurance. People felt comfortable, they had numerical strength, and they didn't reach out to other people, and they should have been persuaded. Gavin Robinson has just written an article there, which is in the Irish News, where he's talking about persuading people for the union. And I would be asking the question, well, what exactly have you been doing for the last 50 years if you haven't been trying to do that? So I think that is a terrible negative point on unionism, that it hasn't been trying to persuade people of the value of the union. It should have been doing that from day one.
The consequence of that, kind of, Terry, was the man behind me over my shoulder, Seamus Heaney, talked in one of his poems about the siege within the siege, describing, the position of nationalists living in a unionist-dominated Northern Ireland. How would you expect people from the nationalist tradition, and I don't think you can always nowadays just talk about Catholics and Protestants, but from the broad nationalist Republican tradition, how would you expect them to react to this centenary of the 100 years of parliamentary rule in Northern Ireland? Partition, of course.
I can understand that people who are nationalist, Republican political outlook don't feel any cause to celebrate. Like the clue's in the name. Why would you? It doesn't measure up to what your political aspiration is. And so I can understand they don't see any cause for celebration. I can understand that the injustice which people suffered gives no cause for celebration. But what I would hope, I've spoken to someone who would be a nationalist, obviously I can't name him, but what he has said to me, he says, I don't feel any need to celebrate, but I am prepared to commemorate what happened and try and look at it from a historical view. And he said, I and my family did okay. He said, we got a house in Craigan. My family got educated. We had the welfare state, which looked after us when we were young. And he said, we all got an education. So he said, whilst there was wrongs and wrongs visited upon the community that I was part of, that isn't the whole narrative. And I was encouraged that someone was saying that. But he quite rightly said he didn't feel he had any need to celebrate or any desire to celebrate. And of course, I can understand that.
Did you ask that person how he would vote in a border poll if one came about, just as a matter of interest? No?
No, I mean, he's a member of a nationalist party, so I would assume that he would probably vote for. Well, I can't assume that, to be honest, Paul. I don't know. I mean, I have not. I mean, you don't live in Derry and not have a lot of friends who are nationalist, Catholic, or none of those labels. I'm very uncomfortable using labels, but I have these conversations, and a lot of people have said to me, "Look, I'm Irish. I'm a cultural nationalist, but if there was a vote for a border poll, there are economic considerations that I would have to weigh up. And many people these days have families living and working in England, and there's connections there, and we travel across. And so who knows? I mean, there's loads of polls and there's loads of speculation. At the end of the day, there's only ever going to be one poll that will count, and that will be if and when it takes place, a border poll.
Yeah, and of course we could be in the series of border polls. I mean, that's how it would work if we ever do get around to that point. Yeah. What do you think Brexit has done to this debate? I mean, what has that done to the line, the border between North and South? What has it done to the Union?
Well, again, there's lots of speculation. I think there was been missed opportunities, but I voted to remain. I would still vote to remain today, but it's done and dusted now, as far as I'm concerned. The decision has been made, and we now need to look and see what might flow from it.
But Terry, as a unionist and a Remain voting unionist, one who wanted to be part of the European Union, do you think that your sort of case for remaining in the union has been undermined or damaged in any way by Brexit?
That's a possibility, but it remains a possibility at the moment because we don't know. Speaking to some people, they're convinced that this is all the end of the union, that Scotland will vote for independence, and that could have a knock-on effect in Northern Ireland. But that's not necessarily the case. It could be, but it's not necessarily the case. There is a way in which it could actually strengthen it. But clearly, with what people are referring to as a border down the Irish Sea, I think it's a trading border, and it's because of what has come out of the negotiations. in the UK made the decision to leave the EU. I've spoken to some people who are members of the Conservative Party here, and I said, look, you voted to leave, so the logic of that is leave. Why didn't you leave and trade on WTO terms, and then sit down and work out how you were going to trade with Europe from then on? I said, but you talked about leaving, but you didn't leave, because then you sat down to negotiate. And once you start to negotiate, there has to be trade-offs. And the trade-off is that there's a trading border down the Irish Sea for the reasons that we all understand. But we don't know yet what's going to flow from that, because there clearly, what Boris Johnson has referred to as teething problems. There was bound to be difficulties, Paul. I mean, that was one of the reasons why I voted to remain. You can't disentangle yourself from 40 years of legislation and processes and practices and not have problems. What I would be feeling now is that Dublin, London, Belfast, Europe have a role to sit down and try and smooth out these difficulties in everybody's interests. Everybody wants to trade with each other. Everybody wants to sell to each other and buy from each other. So they should be sitting down now to try and iron out these difficulties and ensure that the trading and the economies, no one's economies is damaged, because the Irish economy could suffer damage through this. The Northern Irish economy could suffer damage through this. The UK and indeed Europe. So there needs to be a few adults in the room, sit down and get this sorted. Now, it will obviously take some time because of customs arrangements and forms and declarations. But you know, where there's a will, there's a way. And this shouldn't be about punishing anyone, or it shouldn't be about, well, as I say, about punishing anyone. It shouldn't be someone, I mean, Jacob Rees-Mogg made a ridiculous statement the other day in the House of Commons about the fish are now happier to come. I don't know what planet that guy's on, you know. People need to be sitting down and sorting out these difficulties in the interests of mutual benefit to all. And the one thing, the Taoiseach was recently launched, is the shared island unit. And I don't think the current situation is conducive to talking about a shared island. So they need to be getting this sorted sooner rather than later.
When you say the current situation, very briefly, Terry, you mean what?
All what's going on with the trade, because Dublin has been accused of weaponizing the border. I wouldn't use that term weaponize, but there's no doubt it was used as leverage and by both sides. And so people could point the finger and say, well, you helped to cause some of these difficulties. So if that's what people feel, and there's already, the Unionist Party have already come out and said they're not going to engage with the shared island, I think that's a mistake. I think if there's a chair in the room and you're invited to sit on it, you should go in. But they've obviously opted not to do that. So there may be others now who are prepared to do it, that feel, well, look, we need to get these difficulties sorted out first, because this is not the climate or the environment in which we're trying to do this. So it's in everyone's interest, in my view, to try and get these difficulties sorted.
Moving very close to the end of the discussion here, Terry, can I maybe try and roll two questions into one, if I may? I'm wondering, I mean, how soon do you think a border poll is likely to happen? And at that point, of course, we are into that series of rolling 7-year votes. So how soon do you think it's likely to happen? Do you think United Ireland is inevitable? And in that situation, if there was a vote for United Ireland, would you stay in Ireland, in the United Ireland?
Well, you've asked me several questions there.
Yeah. How soon?
Soon, Paul, I know this is trite, but I don't have a crystal ball. You know, I mean, the polls, the Life and Time survey there for 2019 indicated that there was no great appetite for it at the present time. The present Taoiseach has come out and said he doesn't think there should be one for 5 years. Colin Eastwood, the SDLP, has said something similar. Obviously, Sinn Féin have a different political position, and they want to see a border poll sooner rather than later. You have the movement with Colin Harvey and Niall Murphy and so on that are pushing for a border poll because they feel obviously it's opportune. to guess in the next 5 years, it could be the next 10 years. It depends how things settle post-Brexit. How a united Ireland. Well, I read the report by the University in London when they were talking about if there was going to be an Irish referendum, the spade work that would have to be done, and people would need to know exactly what it is that they're voting for. And if you match that up the Richard Humphreys books and the writing of others, the United Ireland, if it develops, could be a very different Ireland to the one that people would have envisaged 100 years ago. For the present time, I think we should be working towards a shared island. And nationalism, for me, in many ways, has had its day. I mean, we're living in a global world, and we should be looking now at building relationships and building connectivity and sharing infrastructure and working to get the most out of our economies. But there could well be a United Ireland. Would I stay? To be honest with you, Paul, I'm not like Arlene. Arlene has said she would buy the ticket and head off in the boat. That would not be my immediate response. I would depend on my family, what they want to do. And it would also depend on the economic situation. Because whilst the Irish economy is seen as doing well, it's pretty expensive to live there.
Yeah. Including healthcare, one of the things you mentioned there.
Yeah,
Okay.
the euro in your pocket, I mean, there's not as much disposable income. People might, in many ways, appear to be earning less, but the actual disposable income goes further.
Terry, look, you've given us much food for thought. You've been very candid, very frank, as I would expect. Typically candid, typically frank, and much smilier than usual, I have to say. So thanks very much.
Subtly, Paul.
Look, Terry, thanks very much indeed for joining us, because I think it's always a kind of a brave thing to do, to sort of put your head up above the parapet here in our community and to talk about big issues. And really, in a way, there's no sort of more important, no more central issue than the whole question of partitioning this island and its implications for both islands here. So thanks for joining us, thanks for sharing your thoughts, and thanks for giving us plenty, I think, to think over in the weeks and months ahead.